Our first speaker of the day comes to us from London, England. He is the publisher of these two books, The Perestroika Deception and Red Cocaine. And he's also publisher of a newsletter called The Soviet Analyst. The bookstore was closed, so I couldn't get in there to get one to hold it up for you, but there's some complimentary copies of his newsletter on the present state of, the perestroika deception, the Gorbachev. Oh, here's one right here. This is his newsletter, The Soviet Analyst. We have some in the bookstore that you can pick up complimentary. It's a superb newsletter, and we recommend it highly. So today, Mr. Story will be speaking to us, and the subject of his conference is Lenin's Satanic World Revolution. Christopher Story.
I'm not a priest. I'm not even a bishop. Even worse, I'm not even a Catholic. But I do believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And in view of the subject I'm going to cover, I think it's important to begin with a devotional reading, because when I asked my friends in New York what on earth I was going to do addressing these eminent personages, they said, keep it secular. If you thought I should have said keep it simple, I'm afraid you've got something coming. So I just want to read the wonderful words of St. Paul, just to put everything which follows in perspective. Put on the whole armour of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. I'm going to speak about spiritual wickedness in high places. When I was sitting in the plane waiting to take off from Heathrow Airport, I looked out of the window and I noticed an Aeroflot plane adjacent to ours, taxiing also for takeoff. I had a close look at this plane, having never seen one close up before in recent years, and I noticed that the tail of the plane was painted in the quote-unquote Russian flag, sort of blue and red and white. I looked at the rest of the plane, and underneath the nose of the plane was a hammer and sickle. Now, I had half thought of saying to the organisers I could actually stop here and they could slot another speaker in, because I've basically said everything I have to say. The important point I want to emphasise is that there has been no discontinuity of Soviet strategy. There has been a Leninist discontinuity. In other words, the whole thing is baloney. It's a pack of lies. Now, it should come as no surprise to us that the Soviets are into lying. And the reason I think there is a connection between my work and that of Father Gruner can be observed in this portrait. Now, you won't be able to see it, and I'm sorry I haven't made a slide of it, but I will pass it round. This is a picture of Lenin, and it appears on all his collected works. It is also, as you will observe if you can see it, a picture of the devil. Now, the Soviets specifically painted Lenin to look like the devil. Last night at dinner I was discussing with some very charming clergy the curious mystery that humanity appears to know the likeness of the devil, because everywhere in the world the devil is painted the same. The face of the devil is almost identical. If you go into any drugstore in New York now, this time of year, you will find, and you know what I'm talking about, the most horrific paraphernalia for Halloween. In my day, we used to call it All Saints' Day, but it's now become All Devils' Day. And the images that you will see in these stores are identical to this image in general terms. To illustrate the point that the Soviet Union continues in existence, a very eminent Sovietologist in Britain called Dr. Martin Dewhurst, who was a friend of mine, spent August in a provincial town in Russia. And he wrote to me the other day and he said that he observed that the most popular newspaper among non-intellectual men, i.e. the working classes, so to speak, was a paper called Soviet Sport, Sovietsky Sport. It is also a fact that the Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, speak of the Soviet Union, and when they refer to St. Petersburg, they talk about Leningrad. Now, the question is, what is the purpose of this operation? In simple terms, Gorbachev presided over the dismantling of the Stalinist model. Now, the Stalinist model, although Stalin was, of course, a Leninist par excellence, his period of rule and the period after it was, in fact, an aberration, because the Stalinist model is rigid. National boundaries are fixed. That is to say, they're fixed until Stalin wishes to grab another state. But I mean, they're fixed. The Leninist model is totally amorphous. There are no fixed boundaries, there are no values, there is nothing except the revolution. The revolution is the only value. And of course, the literal meaning of revolution is going round and round in circles, which is why it's satanic. So we can work that out by parsing and using our brains. It's not very difficult. The main theme of my work these days is to try to help people to understand, and it's very difficult, that we are in the middle of Lenin's satanic world revolution. The phenomena which are being discussed at this meeting among concerned and devoted people are in fact manifestations of this revolution. Now, this can be pinned down academically with documentation, and obviously I've got no time to do that, otherwise you'd be here all day. But I can perhaps pick out a few key elements of this revolution, of this aspect of the revolution. I call it the Gramsci dimension, after Antonio Gramsci, who was the leader of the Italian Communist Party and was imprisoned by Mussolini. And during his imprisonment, he wrote on toilet paper and bits and pieces of paper a document which, when cobbled together, became known as his prison notebooks. And this document is in fact the Bible of the Leninists, although most of us wouldn't know this. And basically they have modelled their revolution after the modus operandi of the Catholic Church. And their idea is, and this is typical of Satan, of course, turn everything upside down. Everything's upside down and back to front, as you know. Their idea is that if they get into the minds of the people, they can influence their behavior. And Mr. Venieri very kindly mentioned Soviet Analyst, and I've got 100 copies, or there were 100 copies in the bookstore. This particular issue I brought on not because I wish to advertise Soviet Analyst for subscription purposes, but because I want to illustrate an important point, which is that the Gorbachev Foundation, which I'll talk about later, is engaged in precisely this agenda. Its purpose is to create and promote altered consciousness and altered behavior. And when people at the dinner table are talking about, you know, the New Age aspect of the attack, because we are under attack, they are actually talking about a dimension of the revolution. We can trace the emergence of the New Age, of course, right the way back to, if you like, the 18th century, but certainly to the second half of the 19th century, which is when the cracks were opened. But Gramsci basically summarized and elaborated this for the purposes of the pursuit of the revolution. And in a nutshell, the objective is to purge our minds, they don't believe in the soul, of everything which we value. Religion is under attack. In my country, the monarchy, of course, is under attack, and I will illustrate how they went about this in due course. So everything that we value, sound education, religion, true religion, revealed religion, morality, is under attack. And it is no coincidence, because it is directed by what has been called by Masons the seething power of Lucifer, or seething powers of Lucifer. I can give you the source of that quotation. The other side know, at least at a high level of Masonry, what they're dealing with. I won't go into the Masonic connection with communism because, again, that is a controversial area, although, in fact, it is relevant. But suffice it to say that all the, quote, luminaries of communism have been Satanists. There's the famous book, of course, Marx and Satan, by the Reverend Richard Wurmbrand. And if you don't know that book, may I highly recommend it. It is a remarkable book. Wurmbrand, who is elderly now, is a Jewish Christian Protestant and a wonderful exponent of the depths to which communism has fallen. He was imprisoned in Romania. His book, Marx and Satan, demonstrates conclusively, with documentary backup, it's not polemical, it's just documents, that Marx, although he came from a Jewish family, was brought up as a Christian and went to university very early, about 16 or 17, and suddenly became a Satanist. He was taken over. And all this is very carefully explained. We know that Stalin, of course, naturally, self-evidently, was in love with the enemy. Specifically, we know that Lenin had a Satanist experience, or an encounter, on the island of Capri. As for Hitler, say no more. Hitler, of course, was a National Socialist, and Nazism is in fact a dialectical elaboration of communism, communism being international socialism, Nazism being National Socialism. That's a dialectic which has, of course, remained. The dialectic, by the way, is central to the revolution. And in case you need a refresher on that, very briefly, The dialectic consists of the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. And if they don't get the synthesis, of course, being what they intend, and if they don't achieve their synthesis, then they start a new cycle. Perhaps the easiest contemporary example of this is the situation in Northern Ireland. And I don't suppose you see much stuff about Northern Ireland in the press here, but if you were to read the British press, you would see pictures of Gerry Adams, who is a Leninist par excellence, speaks in Lenin's special Aesopian language, Aesopian being Lenin's own phrase for the language he invented, which contains double or treble meanings. But not only that, Gerry Adams looks like Lenin and has a beard like Lenin. He speaks like Lenin, behaves like Lenin, and looks like Lenin. In other words, he passes the duck test. If it waddles like a duck, flies like a duck, swims like a duck, and just behaves like a duck, it is a duck. So far as I'm concerned, Gerry Adams is a good example. Now, in the Northern Ireland context, the thesis is 25 years of bombings, maimings. We've got 35,000 people in Northern Ireland who have suffered injury since this particular phase of the Troubles began. I don't know how many dead. I think there's well over 4,000. So that's the thesis. The antithesis is the sudden cessation and the absence of bombings and maimings. And the synthesis, or the intended synthesis, of course, is a unified, radicalized, Leninist Ireland. And what I say to people from Southern Ireland is, it's all very well you tacitly supporting this outrage, or this continuing outrage, but you don't seem to understand that once they get their way in Northern Ireland, they have designs on you. Now, a mystery about the revolution is why they go on with it. I mean, you and I go about our normal work. We get up in the morning, we have breakfast, we say our prayers, hopefully, and we do our thing, and we look after our families, and we try to follow the narrow way. These people never rest. Now, St. Paul explains that why this is the case, and so does Jeremiah, of course. They never rest because they are infected, or I would say possessed, by the seething energies of Lucifer. And in order to understand the revolution, we need to understand that these people are, in a very real sense, possessed. Now, my very paltry knowledge of this subject comes from the late Reverend Malachi Martin, who is really why I'm here, because Malachi befriended me after the publication of the Perestroika Deception. And I would like to pay a special tribute to this holy and wonderful man. To be in his presence, and I say this as a layman, was truly to be in the presence of the Lord. Malachi was controversial because he was looking for the truth. And evil things have been said about this man, and I will identify one of them. I won't dwell on this, but I'd just like to cover this. When he was virtually destitute, he was befriended by a lady called Kakia Lavanos, who is in fact the daughter of one of the great shipping magnates. And for many years, he had a little monastic cell, almost, in her apartment, and I've been there. After he died, in several obituaries, including 2 which appeared in Britain, it was maliciously suggested that she was his mistress, and that I know to be totally false. I know the man, I love the man, I will always love this man. It was Malachi who taught me about possession. Of course, he's the author of a remarkable book called Hostage to the Devil. And again, you notice that you will recall that I prefaced what I'm saying by a reading from St. Paul. If one touches upon this subject, one must pray and one must read the Bible and one must be prepared. So I'm discussing a subject which is in fact painful but has to be faced. The reason we're under attack is because the revolution is in full flood. When the enemy comes in as a flood, be not afraid. We must not be afraid. We must not be intimidated. We must stick to our guns. We must understand. And we must understand where this comes from. Yes, it's satanic. But a primary terrestrial manifestation of the attack is the continuing communist revolution. Now, under Stalin, one of the key advocates of the Gramsci dimension was a hideous character called Lavrenti Beria. And many people in this audience, well, all of you, are of course deeply concerned about the drug problem. Now, the book Red Cocaine, which I had the privilege to edit, which is actually by Dr. Joseph Douglas, who is an intelligence analyst in the Washington area, deals explicitly with the Soviet dimension of the drug offensive and basically demonstrates that the Soviets took over the drug networks in the second half of the 1960s. In a nutshell, they observed the Chinese use of drugs. Of course, the Chinese communists used drugs against their own people. It's important to remember this. Mao Zedong made a number of comments to the effect that the West used drugs against them, so we can use this weapon against the West. And unfortunately, it is true that the British and others used drugs many years ago. But it is nevertheless also true that Mao Zedong and his colleagues deployed drugs in order to achieve supremacy on the Chinese mainland. So anyway, the Russians, the Soviets, watched and saw how the Chinese operated. They then set up their own parallel drug operation. And by the mid to late 1960s, they had not only taken over most of the existing drug networks, either directly or indirectly, but where they encountered opposition, they set up their own. And in the Western Hemisphere, the primary center of coordination is in fact the Americas department of the Cuban Communist Party. Castro being the agent for Moscow here, but all the drug rings in Latin America are related to the Soviets. If you look at any report on what's going on in Colombia, you will always see a reference to Marxist insurgents. They work together. But I want to refer you to a statement by Lavrenti Beria, who was Stalin's police chief, and one of possibly, if it's possible to say this, the most evil man who's ever walked the earth. This is to be found in a book called Brainwashing, a synthesis of the Russian textbook Psychopolitics, with which some of you will doubtless be familiar. We have this text because it was found among the effects of a student at the Lenin School, an American student, who was addressed, they were all addressed by Beria, and the date of this is about 62. This is the key passage, bearing in mind that this comes from the head of the MVD, Interior Ministry. By making readily available drugs of various kinds, by giving the teenager alcohol, by praising his wildness, by stimulating him with sex literature, and advertising to him or her practices as taught at the sex pole, I'll come back to that, the psychopolitical operator can create the necessary attitude of chaos, idleness, and worthlessness into which can then be cast the solution which will give the teenager complete freedom everywhere, communism. Now that, in a nutshell, updated for our era, is basically what's going on. Another weapon they're using, of course, is the exploitation and the promotion of homosexuality. There have been studies done on this subject, but of course I'm not an expert on this, but I understand that the mental and spiritual, quote-unquote, condition which arises as a consequence of such activity is chaotic. So for some reason they have identified, well, no, I didn't say for some reason, they have identified homosexuality as being an instrument of the revolution, as indeed is feminism, as I will come to in a minute. Beria invented the concept of what he called the psychopolitician. And in this context, I can illustrate one further important point, which I think is of great interest to the British, certainly. You will recall Diana, Princess of Wales, and the hideous events which took place just over 2 years ago. You will also recall that the Russian monarchy was basically destroyed by an evil priest named Rasputin. Beria has this to say about how a psychopolitician destabilizes a targeted personality. He writes, the families of these persons, this is, take no notice of his sort of off-the-wall statements, but just listen to the core of what he's saying. The families of these persons are often deranged from idleness and glut, and this fact must be played upon, even created. The normal health and wildness of a rich man's son must be twisted and perverted and explained into neurosis, and then assisted by a timely administration of drugs or violence, turned into criminality or insanity. This brings at once someone in, quote, mental healing into confidential contact with the family, and from this point on, the very most of them must be made of that contact. I don't know why that's a bad syntax, but that's what he said. Now, in the case of Princess Diana, there was a woman from the West Coast, an American called Susie Orbach, and coincidentally, I happen to note that Orbach, O-R-B-A-C-H, is encompassed in the name Gorbachev. Of course, that's a total coincidence. Susie Orbach is, in my opinion, she's a dark woman, and she was on television wall to wall after the Diana events. She is, in my opinion, a psychopolitician. And the Soviets, in their literature, and one of my main sources is to read old Soviet literature, because everything that we are trying to expose is contained in it, boasted that they took over Freud's school in Vienna from the beginning. I can document that. I can't do it now, but I can document that. The Freud school essentially migrated to the West Coast, although, of course, it was headquartered in Vienna. And Susie Orbach is undoubtedly, she passes the duck test, to put it that way. Now, what happened was that this flighty girl, who had been betrayed by her husband, for whom I have very little time, was targeted as a deliberate act of destabilization. And that is an example of how they operate. Joseph Douglas, by the way, the author of Red Cocaine, is an expert also in the use of psychopharmaceutical drugs for the influencing of behavior and altering of consciousness. And one of the points which I think comes out of my special investigation of the Gorbachev Foundation, which is discussed in the special issue of Soviet Analyst, is that the people attending that are in very severe danger. It's very likely, from what we know, that they are being targeted psychopharmaceutically. It could be by aerosols, it could be by stuff put into the tea, who knows. If you look at this issue, really everything I have to say about the Gorbachev Foundation is summarized in this issue. These organizations spawn further organizations as a routine operation. I mean, in Washington we have the Institute for Policy Studies, established by the KGB, which is now the main center of thought in Washington. Virtually every key member of the Clinton administration has a history of association with the Institute for Policy Studies or one of its offshoots. By the same token, the Gorbachev Foundation, which I should say is an offshoot of, or new manifestation of, the Lenin School, the Academy of Sciences, and the International Department of the continuing CPSU. I'll try to come back to that, just as I should come back to the word sexpol. The Gorbachev Foundation is constructing a complex in Moscow, even though it's got no money, measuring 1 kilometer square. We know this because a friend of mine called General Benton Partin in the Washington area was required for some reason to entertain a Russian admiral who had been governor of Kamchatka and is now a member of the Duma, which is the so-called democratist rubber stamp parliament, which in fact is packed with communists. And this man, you know, Russians like to drink, the general being no fool, plied him with a considerable volume of scotch. And in the course of a very long session, the admiral revealed this information, that the Gorbachev Foundation is constructing this colossal complex in Moscow. The general went back to the subject and got the same answer 3 times, which I think is important. When Gorbachev arrived in New York in May 1992 to promote his Gorbachev Foundation, with the assistance of a gentleman called Dr. Jim Garrison, who is certainly an agent of influence, if not worse, having come from the Lenin Institute, which is a Satanic KGB outfit at Big Sur in California. There was a lot of newspaper coverage, particularly in the New York Times, about how important it was that adequate finances should be available to this important project. The Rockefellers were said to have donated $1 million, and within the twinkling of an eye, they had 3 million. Now, the Gorbachev Foundation USA is based on the Presidio, which is a disused base overlooking the bay. It's one of the most beautiful spots in San Francisco. It's actually based in the old Admiral's house right at the very end of that development. And a friend of mine, Bill Jasper, the editor of New American, and I, in 1985, did what in intelligence parlance is called a walk-in. We appeared on site and we walked straight in there. And we were there for about 25 minutes, and as I'm dealing with the enemy, I occasionally adopt the same tactics. And I had a briefcase. I opened this briefcase. I saw all this literature. I shoveled it in I was shoveling stuff in my briefcase, closing it fast and sort of pretending to pay attention to what the man was saying. He disappeared I did this when he was he disappeared into an office. But by, after 25 minutes, they realized we weren't kosher and we had to beat a hasty retreat. Anyway, there's a picture of the Admiral's house in Soviet Analyst. The Gorbachev Foundation is essentially a new manifestation of the Lenin school. And its objective, I know someone has been talking about this before, but I think it's important to give you the benefit of my little knowledge on the subject. The Gorbachev Foundation is an extremely important dimension of the revolution because all those whom Lenin referred to as useful idiots have been attracted. I mean, they really are idiots. They're required to pay $5,000, give me a break, to attend and listen to this absolute garbage. It's all New Age, and it's unspeakable stuff. In some of the seminars, there was a lady I know in Colorado who has attended. She said in 1995, there were seminars on population reduction. And there's a very curious woman called Barbara Marx Hubbard, who openly boasted that she is possessed by an entity called John. So it's very, very bad news. And if you ever meet anybody who is thinking of having anything to do with the Gorbachev Foundation, for goodness sake, illuminate them or put them in touch with me and I'll send them materials. So we need to recognize the enemy, which is sometimes quite difficult to do because when the enemy is serious, as you know, he makes himself invisible. That is not original. It's important also to bear in mind that who Gorbachev is. Before he became General Secretary, he was in charge of the Administrative Organs Department of the CPSU. The Administrative Organs Department was, quote unquote, in charge of and supervised the KGB, the intelligence services, the MVD, the Interior Ministry, and the Armed Forces. There is no possible way that Gorbachev could be anything other than a very senior KGB officer. Now, the idea that these people, that leopards change their spots, that these people all of a sudden put on Savile Row suits, posh accents, stopped their rhetoric, cleaned their teeth, and appeared as normal Democrats is complete and utter nonsense. One piece of research I have to do is to find out precisely when they stopped lambasting the West with their hate rhetoric. But what I do know is that it happened overnight. The Academy of Sciences, which should be renamed the Academy of Leninist Sciences, because that's what it's for, and it continues to exist, spawned a large number of institutes in the 1960s. Now, the other book which I have been privileged to edit and publish, of course, is called The Perestroika Deception, and there are copies of that in the bookstore. It's by a man called Anatoly Golitsyn, who is, I refer to always as the genuine defector. Concerning Soviet defectors, if you can see them, they are false. If they turn up at conferences, if they give interviews, if they write articles, they are not to be trusted. Golitsyn cannot be found. I know he lives in the United States. I deal with his lawyer, but I have never spoken to him. He has corresponded with me. His correspondence is extremely interesting. This is a man of considerable insight, but he was only a major in the KGB when he defected in 1961. And basically, the Perestroika Deception consists of his memoranda to the CIA, in which he tries to explain to this completely mind-controlled organization that they were being taken for a ride. Finally, he gave up and published the material in this book. Actually, he approached me because I had already taken over Soviet Analyst, which used to be published by some Foreign Office types. And this is interesting as well. The people who sold me this title came to me in January 1991, and apparently they said that they didn't wish to continue publishing Soviet Analyst, which had been going since 1972. And I didn't really know why this was, but in retrospect, it would appear that they knew that the Soviet Union would be, quote-unquote, folded. The August coup was, of course, a KGB provocation. And in this connection, you may recall that Gorbachev vanished for 3 days and rose from the dead on the third day. Now, that is not a coincidence. They do this sort of thing. They mimic us. And actually, he rose on the third day on the Russian Feast of the Transfiguration. The object of the folding of the Soviet Union was, of course, the culmination of the folding of the Stalinist model of repression and its replacement by the Leninist model. And one geographical aspect of this was that the republics suddenly became quote-unquote independent. They declared UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence. This is ludicrous. It's totally impossible in a police state. It couldn't possibly have happened without approval and direction from the top. And indeed, that's precisely what happened. The Politburo was expanded in 1990 to 23 members when the party chiefs of the main republics, who were not already members of the Politburo, were inducted into the Politburo and given details of this stage of the operation. All the quote-unquote independent republics of the Soviet Union are, of course, controlled from Moscow. They have penetrated the international institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, so that all of a sudden we have 17 Soviet Unions. To be precise, there were always 3. There was the USSR, Belarusia, and Ukraine for historical reasons. They had seats on in the UN and the other institutions. But these institutions, and I attended the World Bank IMF meeting in late September, these institutions have been significantly taken over by the revolution. And the World Bank is now an instrument of the revolution. It's pushing New Ageism like crazy. You have never seen anything like the stuff that's coming out of the World Bank. One of the aspects one of the dimensions that's being developed by the Gorbachev Foundation and by the United Nations is, of course, the promotion of the concept of NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And in the wonderful new world of the 21st century, the idea is that nation states, as Lenin stated, Lenin's objective, of course, is the destruction of the nation state. Lenin wrote in his collected works that we have as our ultimate objective the destruction of the state. Instead of government structures, the idea is that there is a sort of global network of amorphous sort of groups meeting in various fora who will all coalesce in some kind of meaningless assembly, world parliament or whatever. As a parallel operation, the Gorbachev Foundation is effectively promoting the networking of people whose minds are blown. You know, they're heavily into New Ageism. They are all dabbling in the occult. By the way, the Gorbachev Foundation is into the occult. And I know this for a fact. Samantha Smith told me after 1995 that she herself observed what she called the women, which is the Jane Fondas of this world and Shirley MacLaine and one or two others, shaking like leaves, sort of on a late morning, one morning, after being out very late at night. And she told me that Gorbachev and Raisa, his wife, were at whatever event took place, and one really doesn't want to know what it was. But the occult is a key dimension which the KGB is exploiting, and always has. It needs to be understood that the KGB is a criminal organization. Earlier I mentioned that feminism is an instrument of the revolution, and the authority for this, there are many authorities, of course Lenin's wife, Krupskaya, being the classical one, but perhaps the most telling explanation of this is to be found in an article by Betty Friedan. I'd never heard of Betty Friedan until I came into this subject, but apparently she's a sort of feminist guru-ess. And she writes or wrote the feminist papers in a certain document which I have here called The Nation. This is dated 1981. Betty Friedan's second stage, A Step Backward. Don't forget, one of Lenin's classical remarks was one step forward, two steps back. People sometimes get that back to front. It's important to remember that the deeply Leninist content of that statement. And we read in this article the following bold statement: feminism is not just an issue or a group of issues, it is the cutting edge of a revolution in cultural and moral values. The purpose of feminism, of course, is self-evident, which is the destruction of the family, the creation of enmity between the sexes, and the encouragement of a new generation of children who have no parents. It's revolutionary, it's evil, it's of the devil. I have another reference from Trotsky himself. Trotsky being, by the way, very important in this equation. He wrote, "While we build the movement uniting women against their oppression, we try to win over the most conscious women to join us in building a revolutionary party that can unite all oppressed sectors of the population in decisive struggle against the capitalist class. The women's liberation movement is a central part of the American socialist revolution in the making." Trotsky is alive and well today, as is Lenin. Trotsky, of course, founded the Fourth International, and the importance of the Fourth International should not be underestimated. The Fourth International is behind all the garbage you may come across about the British royal family, about Britain being, for some reason they've targeted Britain. It's a total diversion. Britain being sort of, you know, pushing for world government. The British are finished. We have lost it. We've had it. But for some reason, well, basically throwing sand in the air, the Trotskyites, the Fourth International, the main manifestation in the United States being the LaRouche group, are pushing out this stuff. Don't take any notice of it. The stuff about Prince Charles, he needs his head examining, but he is not the root of all evil. The root of all evil is the revolution. Now, my time is running out, but I'd just like to perhaps semi-conclude by saying that the communist movement is heavily into pushing the Gramsci dimension. Here is a book about lesbian and gay exclusion. How do I obtain this material, I hear you not ask? I have a special friend in New York who dresses up in jeans, and he goes to the Communist Party headquarters, and they've got a basement full of this stuff, and a lot of it has sort of landed up in my office. And this is essential reading. Don't read it, but it is essential to know where this stuff is coming from. There you are, lesbian and gay exclusion, the policy that dares not speak its name. So I can only summarize the position, which is that the revolution is pushing all these things you are worrying about. I coined this, I can credit myself with this, I coined a word which I think is relevant, which is criminalism. Criminalism can be defined as the use of organized criminality in the pursuit of strategy. The Soviet drug offensive is a dimension of criminalism. It's all laid out in red cocaine, but You need to understand where this is coming from, because without a focus, we will continue to be at sea. So remember, Lenin is Satan and vice versa. Thank you very much.